It started as a simple demand, 4 parishioners requesting a financial report from their church's leadership. But within days, all 4 members of the parish council vanished without a trace. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. What began as a quiet call for transparency would unravel a chain of secrets buried beneath decades of trust, devotion, and something far darker than anyone in the congregation could have imagined. It was supposed to be a day of answers. The morning sun spilled gently over the red brick facade of St. Isidore Parish, a modest Catholic church nestled in the heart of rural Kansas. The town of Elmsworth had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors' birthdays by heart. But lately, whispers had begun to swirl among the pews, quiet murmurs about missing funds, donations that never reached their intended causes, and a growing discomfortment among the congregation. The town wanted answers, and they expected to get them today. Inside the church, the air still carried the remnants of incense, its sweet, smoky trail hanging lightly above the worn wooden pews. Parishioners, dressed in their Sunday best, had just filed out at the 9 a.m. Mass. The mood was heavier than usual. Many had stayed behind, gathering near the church hall where a long interviewing place had pushed the parish council for transparency, or key figures, Father Thomas Merrow, Deacon Eli Foster, Treasurer Monica Ray, and Events Chair Harold Clements, had finally agreed to a public session. Copies of the expected report had been promised. Questions were to be answered. But by 10 o'clock a.m., the church hall was still locked, and none of the 4 were in sight. By 10:15, murmurs grew into anxious exchanges. "Maybe they're running late," someone offered, though even that sounded unconvincing. At 10:23, Mrs. Linda Knowles, a retired librarian and longtime parishioner, stepped forward and gently tried the door to the administration building. It creaked open without resistance. Inside, the office was quiet, too quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering faintly as if even the electricity was uneasy, planted solar covering his confusion. "Father Tom?" No answer. She peeked into the adjoining room and immediately froze. On the table, a stack of blank financial folders lay untouched. A carafe of lukewarm coffee sat next to 4 untouched cups. 4 phones, distinctly recognizable by their customized cases, were neatly lined up on the corner shelf. Behind her, footsteps approached. "What is it?" asked Pastor Craig, a young associate priest who had recently moved from Chicago. Linda turned to him, her face pale. "They're gone," she said softly, "but everything else is still here." Craig entered the room cautiously, scanning for any sign of forced entry or disturbance. Nothing looked out of place, no papers scattered, no drawers ajar, no signs of struggle. Yet the silence was unsettling, as though the room had exhaled all its breath at once. Beside the parking lot told a different story. All 4 council members' cars were there, Harold's old blue pickup, Monica's old station sedan, Eli's battered station wagon, and Father Thomas's well-maintained SUV. Their presence only deepened the mystery. No one had seen them leave. No one remembered them stepping out after Mass. It was as though they had vanished, silently and completely, somewhere between Amen and accountability. Police were called by noon. Officer Mark Dillard, a local veteran of the force, was the first to arrive. He took statements, surveyed the scene, and eventually called for backup. "Not your average missing persons," he mumbled to himself. "This smells like something else." By 2:00 p.m., yellow tape was strung around the administration building. The rest of the town watched, stunned, as investigators moved in. Most had never seen crime scene tape in their lives, and certainly not at St. Isidore. By evening, local news vans were parked outside, and reporters asked questions the town didn't have answers for. Could they have fled with the church funds? Were they coerced into silence? Is this connected to other financial misconducts? Speculation bloomed fast and loud. Some believed it was staged to avoid the audit. Others whispered darker theories, blackmail, threats, even objection. But there was no sign of struggle, no messages, no notes, only a locked room, 4 abandoned vehicles, and a promise of transparency that evaporated before it could be fulfilled. In her kitchen later that night, Linda Knowles replayed the moment she'd opened that door, the silence inside, the air still and unbreathable. She hadn't mentioned it to the officers, but she'd noticed one more thing. On the desk near the window, behind the coffee cups, sat a single white envelope, with no name, only the words, "In case of questions," written in a hurried scrawl. She had left it there, and now she regretted it. Officer Dillard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he replayed the footage on the church's outdated security monitor. The grainy black-and-white image flickered as the timestamp blinked, 10:04 a.m., just minutes after the last hymn had ended. The side door of the administration building opened slowly. Out walked Father Thomas, followed closely by Eli, Monica, and Harold, all moving in a line like children trailing behind a teacher. But it was the fifth figure, taller, wearing a plain jacket and baseball cap, face turned from the camera, that stopped Dillard cold. He paused the video and tapped the screen with his pen. "Who the hell is that?" No one in the room answered. Pastor Craig stood to the side, arms folded, his expression rigid. "I've never seen him before," he said, though he sounded unsure. The mystery man didn't glance at the camera, didn't speak to anyone visibly, but he gestured for the group to follow as they exited the frame to the east side of the lot. A second camera, mounted on the church's storage building, should have caught them from that angle. But when Dillard checked the feed, he found only static between 10:05 and 10:40.com. Back inside the rectory, Linda Knowles sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the updates. The envelope she'd found earlier that day now rested in a plastic evidence bag on the table beside her. Dillard had opened it reluctantly, hoping for a note, a clue, anything. Inside had been one item, a church bulletin from last month with a single phrase circled in black ink, "And the truth shall set you free." That was all. No fingerprints, no handwriting sample they could match, just a quote that now felt more like a taunt than a promise. By Monday morning, the town had split into two camps, those who believed the council had orchestrated their own vanishing act, and those convinced something darker had pulled them away. Rumors spiraled into theories into suspicion. The church's Facebook page turned into a battleground of comments and accusations. They took the money and ran. They were being blackmailed. What if this is bigger than our town? One particular post stood out. It was a screenshot sent anonymously to 3 different parishioners, a text message that read, "Don't look. They chose to leave. Let them go." No sender ID, no traceable number, just that single line, cold and direct. Among the recipients was Adrian Collier, a school teacher and longtime member of the parish's youth ministry team. He hadn't planned to tell anyone, not at first, but the message rattled him in a way he couldn't explain. He showed it to Pastor Craig that afternoon, who immediately handed it off to Officer Dillard. "We're not dealing with a simple disappearance," Dillard said quietly. "This is controlled, calculated." He turned his attention back to the mysterious man on the video. A face recognition request had already been sent to state authorities, but no matches had come through. Not in the criminal database, not in missing persons, not even in any local church records. It was as if he didn't exist. And yet, he clearly had influence. The way the council followed him, not with hesitation, but with grim resolve, suggested familiarity, trust even. Why would 4 respected members of the parish, each known for their devotion and stability, suddenly walk away without telling a soul, abandoning not only their duties, but their families, their homes, their lives? Monica's sister had visited her apartment that morning to feed her cat and found her phone charger plugged in, 2 mugs still sitting in the sink, nothing packed, nothing planned. Her passport was still in the drawer. Eli's lawn was uncut, his Sunday paper untouched. Father Thomas's Bible remained open on his bedside table, a sticky note still pressed between the Psalms, with the words, "Finance audit, be honest," scribbled in his handwriting. None of it made sense, unless they hadn't planned to leave at all until that very moment. Dillard returned to the footage again, this time watching not just the exit, but what came before. He noticed something odd, a flicker of movement in the window of the administration room, moments before they left. A reflection. For a split second, someone else was in that room, someone who never appeared again. He asked for the original tapes to be sent to the lab for enhancement. Meanwhile, Adrian sat alone in his classroom after hours, scrolling through old emails from the parish. He was looking for anything, any reference, name, or event that might connect the council members to someone outside the church. He paused on an archived thread from 3 months ago, a fundraiser titled Sanctuary Renewal Night. The event had been canceled last minute with no explanation. The reason given had been unforeseen spiritual conflict, whatever that meant. Adrian opened the attachment. It was a list of volunteers and guests, One name stood out: J. Lennox. He didn't recall ever meeting anyone by that name. He copied it down and began searching. Nothing came up until he added the keyword St. Augustine. An old blog post surfaced, archived from a defunct theology forum. J. Lennox had commented on a thread discussing the role of financial ethics in small parishes. The comment was brief, cryptic. When faith becomes currency, redemption is bought, not earned. Some debts are collected in silence. Adrian felt a chill. He forwarded everything to Officer Dillard and leaned back in his chair, feeling as if he'd just stepped into the middle of something far beyond his understanding. Across town, in the darkened office of the church, the power flickered. A single red light blinked silently from the back of the network server. The surveillance footage had only been part of what was recorded that day. The real video, the one from the restricted internal drive, remained untouched, encrypted behind a password no one had used in years. Until now, a terminal in the rectory basement hummed to life. By Wednesday afternoon, the tension in Elmsworth had begun to shift from collective concern to individual panic. Inside the modest living room of Monica Ray's ranch-style home, her sister Caroline sat across from Officer Dillard, with a box of documents pulled from Monica's home office stacked between them. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from days of anxiety and little sleep. "She didn't pack anything," Caroline repeated for the third time. "Nothing's missing. No clothes, no toiletries, not even her planner." She pulled out a file folder containing bank receipts, each one printed and paper-clipped neatly. "But this," she added, sliding a final slip across the coffee table. "This happened the night before she vanished." Dillard leaned in. Receipt was a withdrawal confirmation, $43,900.00, pulled from a joint savings account at 11:38 p.m., just hours before Monica would vanish with the rest of the council. The transaction was made at a 24-hour ATM in a town 30 miles away. Was this typical behavior for her? Dillard asked. Carolyn shook her head. She'd been saving that money for years, for retirement, for a trip to Ireland. She never touched it, not once. Meanwhile, across town, Eli Foster's teenage daughter, Cassidy, had been left alone in the family's creaky farmhouse since the incident. Her mother, having passed years ago, left Eli as the only parental figure, and now he too had disappeared into a silence that didn't make sense. She had spent 2 nights sleeping in the living room, too unsettled to stay in her bedroom, and had finally decided to go through her father's things in search of answers. He wasn't the kind of man to leave without a note. He was routine to the point of monotony: morning prayers at 6, toast and coffee at 7, a brisk walk by 8. He had always kept a small black notebook in his coat pocket, one he used to write sermon notes and verses he wanted to memorize. When Cassidy opened his closet and found the jacket slung over the hanger, her heart skipped. The notebook was still inside. She sat on the bed, the old mattress creaking beneath her, and flipped through the pages. Most of it was scripture or lists of things to do. Call the insurance company, remind Monica to pick up donation forms, check on the church furnace. But near the middle of the notebook, between a page on Corinthians and a coffee-stained receipt from a hardware store, was something she had never seen before. A heading scrawled in bolder handwriting than the rest read, "Festival of Grace. Invitation only. Bring it this way." Beneath it were cryptic notations: October 8, meet at Cedar Point Lot, midnight, wear dark clothing, silent procession. The next page listed only names: Monica, Thomas, Harold, and finally a fourth name she didn't recognize. Cassius stared at the writing, her skin prickling. She had never heard of this event. There had been no mention of it in Sunday bulletins, no signs or flyers, nothing in the monthly newsletters her father always made sure the congregation received. She took a picture of the pages with her phone and texted them to Pastor Craig, with one line: "Does this mean anything to you?" Back at the station, Dillard stared at the ATM footage pulled from the bank where Monica's transaction had occurred. A grainy image of her car pulling up confirmed her presence, and though the camera couldn't capture her expression clearly, the way she sat, rigid, looking side to side, suggested something more than a late-night financial decision. She wasn't alone. A man in a hoodie stood just outside the camera's edge, barely visible. The shape of his body matched the unknown figure seen in the church video. Dillard paused the frame again. No clear face, but the outline of a beard, possibly white or gray. When Pastor Craig received Cassidy's text, he was alone in his office, rereading the Psalms in search of some elusive sense of grounding. Her message stunned him. Festival of Grace? It triggered something in his memory, a vague recollection of a conversation he'd overheard his first month in Elmsworth between Father Thomas and Deacon Eli. Something about a private retreat for those who understand sacrifice. At the time, he thought it was a clergy training or a spiritual sabbatical, but now he wasn't sure. He replied quickly, "Do not show this to anyone else. I'll come to you." Within the hour, he arrived at the Foster house where Cassidy handed him the notebook. He read the passage twice, then 3 times. "This changes everything," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Cassidy crossed her arms. "Was my dad in a cult?" Craig winced. "I don't know, but if this is real, they didn't just vanish. They joined something." Cassidy's face fell. "But they weren't forced?" "I don't know," he repeated, unsure if he meant to reassure her or himself. By nightfall, whispers of Festival of Grace had reached a small circle of parishioners, including Linda Knowles, who had begun organizing a community vigil. But when she asked Craig about the phrase, his response was unusually guarded. "It's probably nothing," he said, "just an old event name." But Linda wasn't convinced. That night she searched her email archive and found nothing. No past bulletins, no historical mentions of the term. She even combed through 5 years' worth of scanned church records. Nothing. It was as if the phrase had been erased from all official history, but still lived in the margins, in whispered meetings and in black notebooks. Outside the Foster house, a white van idled 2 streets over. Inside, a man in a ball cap adjusted the frequency on a small handheld scanner. He jotted something in a small leather-bound book. Then he waited. By Friday morning, the tension that had once simmered quietly beneath the surface of Elmsworth boiled over into whispered accusations and private confrontations. At the church's weekly community breakfast, usually a time of comfort and routine, a silence lingered between bites of toast and lukewarm coffee. People avoided eye contact, unsure whether they were being watched or simply paranoid. It was there, at a back table beneath the faded photograph of the church founders, that Mary Beth Lorne, an 82-year-old parishioner who had attended St. Isabel since she was a child, cleared her throat and looked up at the small group of regulars surrounding her. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began, her voice slow but unwavering. "But this isn't the first time someone from the council has disappeared." The table went still. Pastor Craig, who had just arrived with a tray of muffins, stopped in his tracks. "What do you mean, Mary Beth?" he asked. She met his gaze, unblinking. "I mean what I said. Back in '93, there was a man, Joseph Winters. He handled the books before Monica ever came around. One day he just stopped coming. Said he was taking time off. No one ever saw him again. No obituary, no family visit, just gone." She looked down at her hands, her voice dropping. "I asked questions. I was told it was private church business." The words spread through town faster than wildfire. By that afternoon, Pastor Craig received a voicemail from a local reporter, Melanie Grant, who worked for the Elmsworth Chronicle, a small but persistent publication that rarely made waves. But Melanie wasn't interested in gossip. She had heard the whispers, and something about Mary Beth's account had triggered a memory from her early years at the paper. Digging into the archive room that smelled of old paper and forgotten stories, she pulled up an editorial from 2003 about a man named Thomas LeClaire, the parish's treasurer at the time, who had resigned suddenly, citing health issues. There were no follow-ups, no photos, no retirement party, just a farewell note printed in that week's bulletin. Her curiosity piqued. 10 years prior to that, in 1983, another name surfaced, Elijah Byrne, also tied to church finances, a single mention in an annual report. Then nothing. No job change, no community tribute, just a name scrubbed from local conversation. 3 people, 30 years, each one gone in intervals of exactly 10 years, and now, in 2023, the 4th disappearances, Monica Ray. Melanie's fingers trembled slightly as she took notes. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. She called Dillard, who, though skeptical, agreed to meet her in person. Meanwhile, Mary Beth's comment stirred more than just historical curiosity. She later confided in Linda Knowles over tea at the community center, her eyes glassy with age and something deeper: regret. It wasn't just the missing people, she whispered. It were donations, large ones. Years ago, after my husband died, I wanted to contribute something to the parish in his name. Father Thomas said I could make a private gift, something more personal, something that wouldn't be processed through the usual accounts. Said it would go to a special fund for spiritual preservation? Linda looked at her, confused. But why wouldn't he just take it as a regular donation? Mary Beth shook her head. I asked. He said the fund needed to remain discreet, pure, he called it. I gave him a check for $5,000, 0 cents. He handed me a prayer card and told me I had done something truly sacred. I never got a receipt, never saw my husband's name mentioned in any memorials. It just vanished. At the station, Dillard sat across from Melanie as she laid out her findings. 3 names, 3 10-year gaps, all tied to financial roles. That's a pattern, she insisted. Dillard rubbed his temples. It's circumstantial, she corrected, and combined with the undocumented donations and that notebook from Cassidy Foster, it tells a story. Dillard couldn't argue. The picture forming was hazy but disturbing, a recurring purge of financial figures, ritualized giving, a secret event, and each time no one looked deeper. Melanie proposed a timeline, complete with photocopied church records and marked gaps in leadership roles. Dillard scanned them, then pulled out a report from Monica's office, one he had initially dismissed as unimportant. It was a donation log, neat but incomplete. Several entries were marked Private Trust, see Father Thomas Merrow, but the corresponding amounts, some exceeding $10,000, 0 cents, were never noted in the church's official budget. Back at the Foster house, Cassidy stared at her father's notebook again. She flipped past the pages about the Festival of Grace and stopped on a page she had missed. Contact list, donors, it read. Below were initials and amounts. MBLHKHS 2.5K. None had names attached, but Cassidy recognized MBL. Mary Beth Lorne. The date matched the year her husband had died. Cassidy printed the page and brought it to Pastor Craig, who grew visibly tense. This shouldn't exist, he muttered. Why? She asked. Because it means there's been a shadow system in place for years, he admitted, and it was protected, hidden behind doctrine, made sacred so no one would question it. That evening, Melanie received an unmarked envelope at the Chronicle. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a flash drive. The paper read, Ask about the 1983 retreat. Ask about the land behind the old mission house. She plugged in the drive. A video played, grainy, distorted, but real. A group of people in robes standing in a circle, chanting in the woods at night. One held a book, another a shovel. No faces were clear, but the voice that opened the gathering was unmistakable. Father Thomas, years younger, speaking slowly. We gather again to preserve what must remain unseen. The air was heavy with suspicion now, not just among outsiders or the curious, but within the very heart of St. Isidore Parish. It had seeped into every meeting, every casual exchange in the parking lot, every glance between members of the congregation who used to trust without question. Among them was Marcus Bell, a 37-year-old electrician and lifelong member of the church who rarely involved himself in anything beyond volunteer maintenance work and usher duties. But something about the disappearances, especially Monica's, whose son had once been his apprentice, didn't sit right with him. The silent, obedient nature of those who vanished contrasted too sharply with the methodical chaos left behind. He didn't believe they were dead, but he also didn't believe they had simply walked away. When Melanie Grant's report reached public circulation through a printed supplement at the town library, Marcus noticed one small detail most had overlooked, a mention of church-owned land at the northern edge of Elmsworth, land that had once belonged to a farming family before being donated in the 1960s. It had been largely forgotten, never developed, and referred to as spiritual preserve in archived documents. The term felt familiar. He remembered once helping Father Thomas fix a leaky pipe near the north fence, years ago, and the priest had joked about the old meditation shack beyond the trees that no one was allowed to use anymore. It was a throwaway comment then. Now it haunted him. On a quiet Saturday morning, Marcus drove his rusted pickup out past the known boundaries of the church's grounds, up a narrow gravel path covered in moss and soft pine needles. The land was thick with trees, undisturbed and silent, and for a moment he questioned whether he had the right location at all. But then, nestled in a clearing behind a low ridge, he saw it. A weather-worn wooden cabin, half swallowed by time. A crude wooden sign hung sideways from a nail, the paint barely legible. Sanctum. The front door had a rusted padlock and a county notice stapled to the frame, dated July 1998, property saved, unenviably unhinged. But the seal had already been broken. The lock hung uselessly on one hinge. Marcus hesitated only a moment before pushing inside. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not mold, but something dense and stale, like paper left in a damp room for too long. Dust swirled in the beams of sunlight cutting through the boarded windows. The main room was sparse: a table, 2 wooden chairs, a fireplace filled with ash long cold, and shelves lined with books that had bowed under moisture and age. He ran his fingers along the spines. Some were religious texts, others were obscure, philosophical works, treatises on ethics, psychology, and a few titles in Latin. A cracked kettle sat near the sink. In the corner, a trapdoor lay half-covered by an old rug. Marcus lifted it and found a narrow staircase leading downward. The cellar was nothing like the space above. As he descended, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. The walls were concrete, not timber, and someone had clearly invested time and effort reinforcing the space. Soundproof cleaned, a cot sat against one wall, with a worn mattress and a folded wool blanket at its foot. Beside it, a portable gas lantern and an empty soup can. Someone had stayed here. For days, weeks, maybe longer. The far wall bore a bulletin board covered in faded pages, index cards, maps of the church grounds, newspaper clippings, even printed emails with certain words circled in red. But what drew Marcus's attention was the binder lying open on a metal desk, the pages yellowed but meticulously organized, the cover red below it, Draft 3, internal use only, not for distribution. He flipped the pages slowly, his skin crawling as he read. The content wasn't scripture. It wasn't religious reflection either. It was something else entirely. A set of philosophical frameworks, arguments, and psychological justifications for spiritual manipulation. Phrases like faith as leaving and obedience through sacral fear, repeated often, outlined with examples from real-world settings. Diagrams of church hierarchies had annotations beside certain roles: conduit, witness, absorber, atom vessel. There were case studies, anonymized but disturbingly detailed, cases of confession rituals pushed beyond traditional doctrine, of participants entering sacred silence, and of individuals voluntarily severing ties with secular life to remain in spiritual stasis. At the end of the binder, a checklist. 4 names were typed next to 4 empty boxes: Monica Ray, Eli Foster, Harold Clements, Thomas Merrow. Next to each, in faint pencil, someone had begun to fill a checkmark. Only Monica's was complete. Marcus closed the binder and turned, his breath caught in his throat. On the floor behind the cot, hidden under a loose floorboard, he spotted a small box with a latch. Inside it were cassette tapes labeled with dates ranging back to the 80s, and a recorder. He took one at random, inserted it, and hit play. Static crackled for a moment, then a voice, unmistakably Father Thomas's, soft and slow. Today we reaffirm the truth beneath the world's lie, that salvation, true salvation, is not freely given. It is earned, purchased. And sometimes hidden, Marcus stumbled back, adrenaline spiking. He grabbed the binder, the tapes, and snapped a few photos of the room with his phone before retreating upstairs. As he stepped back into the daylight, the forest suddenly felt more watchful, more enclosed. He looked over his shoulder as he hurried to his truck, the binder clutched tight under his arm, the voice from the tape still echoing in his mind. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He placed the binder, the tapes, and his notes in a fireproof box and locked it inside his garage tool cabinet. Then he sat in his kitchen, lights dimmed, trying to make sense of what he had found. The binder hadn't just disturbed him, it had reshaped how he saw the people he had known for years. And the voice on the cassette, that soft, assured cadence of Father Thomas, was no longer comforting. It now rang with veiled intention. By Sunday morning he decided to bring one name into the circle: Melanie Grant. She arrived at his home within the hour, notebook in hand, and he didn't waste time. He laid everything out across his dining table. As she flipped through the binder and read the highlighted phrases, her jaw tightened. "This isn't just rogue theology," said this. "It's a framework, almost corporate." That word stuck with Marcus. Corporate. It didn't feel religious, not fully. It was too structured, too calculated. Melanie frowned, flipping to the back of the binder. A final page was tucked inside the flap, an index of references used in the manuscript's construction. One name repeated in multiple footnotes: White Column Society. Melanie's eyes narrowed. White Column Society. I've heard that name. She reached into her laptop bag, pulled out an old USB, and opened a folder of archived grant records she had once compiled while researching nonprofit activity in Elmsworth. There it was, line 14. Donor White Column Society. Amount $72,000, 0 cents. Purpose: restoration of St. Isidore's Eastern Wing. Date: 2002. She scrolled further. 2003, $38,000, 0 cents, for spiritual enrichment materials. 2004, $19,000, 0 cents, for clergy training. And then, nothing. After 2005, the name vanished from all local financial trails. "I thought they were just a philanthropic group," she said, "but no one I asked ever really knew who they were." Marcus leaned over the files. "Why stop funding after 2005? She shook her head. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just stopped using their name. Later that day, Melanie returned to the Chronicle's archives to comb through documents from the early 2000s. In the town hall's dusty records room, she located a box labeled Religious Building Permits 1999-2006. Inside, under layers of faded copies, she found a sealed manila envelope marked in red ink. There was no official town seal, no church insignia. Inside were 3 pages, each partially torn, edges singed as if someone had attempted to destroy them. She carefully pieced the pages together using transparent tape on her office whiteboard. The first sheet was a letter on heavy paper, typed and unsigned. As agreed, the 4th phase of the behavioral integration should commence no later than Q3 of the fiscal year. Parish Contact TM has confirmed initial compliance. We expect full implementation by the end of the liturgical cycle. Parish Contact TM, Father Thomas Merrow. Melanie's stomach churned. The second page was an internal memo, likely between members of the White Column Society. It referenced terminology from Marcus's binder: deep cycle devotions, atonement structures, and voluntary sequestration. A chart outlined projected outcomes tied to specific psychological triggers: guilt, salvation, urgency, communal isolation. The level of planning unnerved her. This wasn't religious at all. It was psychological engineering under the mask of faith. The final sheet was the most troubling. It listed a timeline of actions labeled as stage milestones. One line read, 2003, Phase 2, Implementation. Disappearances: Claire Jacuar, who had vanished that year. They had documented it as a calculated milestone. That evening she called Marcus and read every word aloud. He didn't respond at first, then quietly said, "We need to know how many others were involved." They met again in the basement of the church's old activity center, a place rarely used anymore. There, under flickering fluorescent lights, they spread the documents across a folding table. Marcus remembered a locked filing cabinet tucked into the back office of the parish records room, one that had always been off-limits under the guise of historical preservation. He returned that night, jimmied the lock with a flathead screwdriver, and found a stack of black folders inside. Some were blank, others had only initials. But one stood out. TM, photocopies of meeting schedules, payment vouchers, and handwritten notes by Father Thomas himself. In one, Thomas had written, "Ensure Monica is briefed on spiritual integration protocols. Her trust in doctrine will ease transition." Another note dated just weeks before the disappearances. "Final review complete. All 4 aligned. WCS approval pending. Melanie documented everything, photographing each page, scanning what she could. Then she found something even more damning, a list titled External Communications Observer. Among the names was a local psychologist, a board member of the county health department, and, shockingly, someone listed only as ER Chronicle. Melanie's own newspaper. Her hands trembled. Someone from her own circle had known, maybe even collaborated. They took the findings to Officer Dillard, who stared at the papers for nearly an hour in silence. "If this is real," he said slowly, "then every assumption we've made about those disappearances has to change. They weren't crimes in the legal sense. They were orchestrations, disguised compliance." He looked up, and WCS. They're not just donors, they're directors. That night, Marcus drove past the church, past the quiet homes that lined the hill, and out to the edge of the forest again. He sat in his truck, the binder beside him, and stared into the dark beyond the trees. The words from the binder repeated in his mind: truth beneath the lie, salvation as transaction, obedience as currency. Behind it all, a name that no one in Elmsworth had dared question for decades. White Column Society. The more Marcus and Melanie uncovered, the more apparent it became that Father Thomas had not acted alone. The orchestrated nature of the disappearances, the carefully worded documents, and the repeated references to stage milestones pointed to a collaborative effort involving multiple figures within the church. While the town had always regarded the parish council as pillars of trust, the emerging truth painted a far more conflicted picture. It was within one of the scanned documents, buried in a footnote attached to a meeting record labeled Private WCS Consult, June 2004, that Melanie found a name not previously associated with the deeper planning: Harold Clements. The events chair, known for organizing fundraisers and seasonal retreats, had always played a background role in parish politics. Friendly, quiet, efficient, no one suspected Harold of anything more than an affinity for logistics. But here, in a letter signed by a GR Securities facility, his name appeared in plain type. Re Clements. Initial contact made 2003. Expressed concerns over public perception due to rumors of financial misappropriation. Seeks support in preserving institutional integrity through non-disclosure solutions. Melanie read the line again, her voice flat. He reached out to them first. Marcus felt the blood rush to his ears. He didn't get pulled into this, he said. He volunteered. The notion changed everything. If Harold had contacted the White Column Society before the rest of the council had even been approached, that meant the foundation of this entire structure wasn't influentiation, it was invitation. Dillard confirmed the time-stamped phone logs that backed up the story. A series of encrypted VoIP calls routed through an international server traced back to a shell corporation in Toronto, one previously linked to WWCS funding. Each call lasted between 3 and 7 minutes. The earliest recorded date, February 14, 2003. A fitting symbol, perhaps, for the loyalty Harold had pledged, not to his parishioners, but to a group whose mission remained cloaked in spiritual rhetoric and clinical control. It was this detail that led Marcus back to the cabin. Something about Harold's name, now attached to betrayal, compelled him to revisit the place where the first layers of the truth had been peeled away. He returned alone, with gloves and a flashlight, and retraced his steps into the cellar. But this time he noticed something new. The cot had been moved slightly, the dust on the floor was disturbed, and on the desk, where the binder had once rested, lay a different object, a small notebook with a dark blue cover. It was newer than the other materials, its pages crisp, the ink unfaded. Inside were brief entries, all written in Harold's neat minimalist handwriting. The first few pages contained quotes from Scripture, paired with, "Quote is silence, truly passive," but toward the middle the tone shifted. "They needed control. I offered it. Better that I manage the fire than let it burn uncontrolled." Another page. WCS promised containment, not just of funds, but of panic. I agreed, because panic destroys churches. Faith bends. Panic snaps. Marcus swallowed hard. Harold hadn't been coerced. He'd rationalized his actions as damage control. To him, transparency was a threat, one that needed managing from the shadows. The final entry was dated 2 days before the disappearances. Final instructions received. They want full withdrawal, no trail. I will go with them to ensure silence. I trust Thomas, but not Eli. Monica is wavering. If she breaks, the structure fails. Marcus flipped the notebook shut and stood motionless for several seconds. The implications were clear. Harold hadn't just joined them. He had planned the retreat, coordinated the timing, identified weaknesses, and now he was gone. Or at least he had been. Because tucked beneath the cot was a worn canvas duffel bag, its contents still inside. Clothes, a map, an ID, and a keychain with the St. Isidore emblem. It looked untouched. Marcus pulled out a water bottle, still half full, and unscrewed the cap. The smell was sharp. Bleach, not water, not drinkable. Something was wrong. He stepped back and scanned the room again. There was no sign Harold had left, no tracks, no suitcase removed. Just one cryptic notebook and a single, chilling absence. Harold had never exited the cabin. He had vanished from within it. Marcus called Dillard, who arrived with the forensics team an hour later. They searched the perimeter, the woods, even the soil behind the cabin. No signs of struggle, no biological trace. The only notable detail was a single fingernail indentation on the trapdoor frame, as if someone had tried to grip the edge and failed. When questioned later, Pastor Craig admitted that Harold had been unusually quiet in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. He had pulled out of a charity event, canceled 2 regular meetings, and once left Mass midway through a reading. He said he was fasting, Craig recalled, but it didn't look like spiritual discipline. It looked like fear. Town's belief that the council had walked away willingly began to crack. Harold's vanishing, absent any physical preparation, challenged the idea of a clean, voluntary escape. If he had helped engineer this disappearance, then what had he become afraid of? And more importantly, what had silenced him before he could leave? Melanie compiled her notes into a timeline. Harold's contact with WCS, his shift in behavior, his final entry, his disappearance. She pinned a photo of him beside a larger map detailing the church grounds, with a red thread drawn from the cabin to the main sanctuary. Something still connected them, some step they had all agreed upon, and one that Harold may have hesitated to complete. That evening, Marcus returned to the garage and reopened the binder. He turned to the index, then to the appendix. One passage had escaped his attention earlier, an addendum labeled Stage 4 Risks, Contingency Protocol. It read, "If any designated participant fails to uphold commitment, removal is authorized. External exposure forbidden." The words landed like ice in his chest. Removal is authorized. Not metaphor. Not symbolic. The unraveling had reached a point where even the most devout members of St. Isidore could no longer deny the gravity of what had taken root beneath the surface of their parish. With Harold's disappearance from within the cabin and the binder's mention of removal authorizations, Marcus knew that whatever structure had guided these orchestrations was not only still active, it was adapting. The question now was how far it reached and how many layers of secrecy remained untouched. Dillard, though cautious not to inflame public panic, gave Marcus and Melanie one final green light, access to a long-sealed office within the rectory. The room once belonged to Thomas Merrow and had remained locked since the council's disappearance, under the assumption that nothing relevant remained. That changed when Marcus, sorting through documents in the back of the sacristy storage, found a labeled key, Vault 2, 2 entries. He and Dillard entered the office late one afternoon under fading light, the air inside musty, untouched. Behind the heavy oak desk was a narrow wall safe, partially concealed by a false wooden panel painted to match the trim. Dillard broke it open. Inside were 2 envelopes, a flash drive, and a plastic binder marked Quarterlies Discretionary. It was this last item that brought silence to the room. The binder, crisped and carefully formatted, each with a hand-written note in the margins. Melanie, summoned minutes later, joined them and flipped to the section marked FY 2021. Halfway down the page, a line item stood out, Spiritual Sanitization Services, $287,450, 0 cents. The payment had been routed through a trust with no known account holder. The description field was blank, no invoice attached. No vendor listed, just a date, an amount, and the initials HRD in the corner, Harold R. Clements. Melanie flipped further back. In FY 2018, $196,000, 0 cents under Silence Maintenance Initiative. In FY 2015, $320,000, 0 cents under it. At a narrow document, no line of decision of dates contained these entries. These were internal records, never meant to be seen, coded and buried beneath layers of misleading documentation. Dillard ran the flash drive through the department's secure computer system and found spreadsheets cross-referencing those funds to a bank in Montreal, another shell account tied indirectly to the White Column Society. The financial infrastructure wasn't just large, it was international. Marcus stood near the window, barely able to speak. $300,000? For what? For rituals? Melanie shook her head. For obedience, for silence, for containment. She opened the second envelope. Inside were handwritten letters, each folded with care and bound by a single red ribbon. One letter, addressed to the faithful custodians of truth, was signed by Thomas Merrow. The date was 1 week before his disappearance. The content was even more disturbing. As we conclude the fiscal cycle, I am relieved to report that the final quadrant has reached compliance. Though Monica required extensive reinforcement, Eli's alignment eased her transition until the end. We believe the fourth pillar has been secured. I will deliver the final packets north, as arranged. Melanie's eyes darted to the last line. Deliver the packets north. That word again. North. 2 days later, the connection clicked into place. A trooper from upstate Vermont emailed Dillard with a match on a vehicle license plate. A traffic camera positioned along Route 217, just 20 miles south of the Canadian border, had captured a silver sedan driving northbound 3 weeks after the initial disappearance. The plate belonged to Monica Ray. The timestamp was precise, 2:47 a.m., mid-October. The car was registered as inactive at the time, not reported stolen. The image quality wasn't high enough to identify the driver, but it showed a silhouette, a single occupant, possibly female, possibly Monica. The implications shattered the theory that all four had vanished simultaneously. If Monica's car was moving weeks later, she, or someone using her identity, had either evaded the retreat or returned. Marcus recalled the notebook from Harold, the line about Monica wavering. If she breaks, the structure fails. Had she broken, or had she been removed like Harold? Melanie immediately filed a request for additional footage along the Route 217 corridor. 3 other cameras failed to show the same vehicle, but one captured a glimpse of a figure at a rest stop 20 miles further north. The silhouette walked to a payphone. No call record was found, but the timestamp aligned precisely with the camera hit on Monica's car. Back in Elmsworth, Pastor Craig faced mounting pressure from the congregation. He had remained guarded until now, playing the part of a grieving but informed leader. But a closed-door meeting with Dillard and Melanie forced him to acknowledge that the events unfolding around them had deeper historical roots. "We knew about White Column," he confessed. "The full extent, not the methods, but we were aware that they once funded us. Thomas said they were benefactors, that they offered stability when our finances were failing." He paused. "But after 2005, everything changed. The donations stopped, but the influence didn't. It became more veiled. Once, I was told they were for retreat, counseling for clergy. I never imagined this." Dillard laid the binder in front of him. "They're not just records. They're proof of a systemic operation, controlled, funded, and expanded under your watch." Craig lowered his eyes. "I didn't want to believe Thomas capable of such manipulation. He believed he was preserving faith. But this isn't faith. It's fear disguised as sanctity." That night, Melanie sat alone in her office, staring at a photo of Monica from a community event in 2019. She zoomed in on Monica's eyes. Something about them, open, alert, but never truly at rest, felt different now. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a pawn. She had known something, perhaps even tried to stop it. And now she was somewhere near the border. Running from what? The discovery of Monica's vehicle near the Canadian border had shifted the investigation's trajectory from a presumed spiritual exodus to something far more entangled with criminal enterprise. Melanie, now working almost around the clock, cross-referenced financial records, vehicle sightings, and archived correspondence. It was during this exhaustive combing through her Chronicle contacts that she received a message from a name she hadn't seen in nearly 5 years, Ellis Warren, a retired forensic accountant and once a discreet member of St. Isbury's financial subcommittee. His email was brief but heavy, quiet, too long. Meet me, no phones. The next evening, they met at an old diner on the edge of town. Ellis, now well into his 60s, appeared thinner, more watchful. He slid a USB across the table, wrapped in an unmarked napkin, and said, "This should have come out years ago, but I was scared. I still am." The file on the drive, once decrypted, contained a single audio clip, timestamped March 17, 2022. The voice that opened the call was unmistakably that of Harold Clements. He was speaking in a low, strained tone to an unknown recipient. "We found it," Harold said. "The ledger didn't match. Monica traced the account. It's not just internal, it's outside. Real estate contracts, dummy corporations, they're laundering through the church." A pause, then a reply, muffled, male, angry. "You were supposed to maintain order, Harold, not unravel it." Harold's voice hardened. "You lied. You said the white column was oversight. You didn't say they were part of it. This is fraud. Criminal." The other voice replied, "And what are you going to do? Take it to the board?" "The board's us." The clip ended with a single click, the sound of Harold hanging up or someone ending the recording. Melanie listened 3 times before looking at Ellis. "Why didn't you go public?" He shook his head. "Because weeks later, someone left an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside, a photo of my daughter, her school, a note, 'You won't hear the next warning.' I resigned the next day." Despite his fear, Ellis handed over a second file, a complete forensic analysis of discrepancies he had quietly flagged before stepping down. It showed nearly $1,200,000, 0 cents in undocumented funds moving between church maintenance budgets and a real estate firm named Brulin Holdings, registered to a P.O. box in Elmsworth but headquartered in Albany. Branglin, as it turned out, had been purchasing foreclosed properties across the region and flipping them to shell companies, many of which were listed under religious-sounding nonprofits. The church's land, particularly the unused tract near the old mission, had been assessed at inflated values, then donated back into the system through WCS-affiliated charities. It was a classic laundering cycle, masked under ecclesiastical operations. What stunned Melanie most wasn't the scale. It was the orchestration. The council hadn't merely misused funds, they had built an ecosystem where faith was the storefront and land the currency. Within days, Ellis received another envelope, this one containing a single line typed on plain paper, "You were warned." But something had shifted in him. Perhaps it was the guilt, perhaps the years of silence wearing thin. He contacted Pastor Craig and publicly released the financial report through the Chronicle. The town exploded. News of the laundering scandal tore through Elmsworth like wildfire. Sunday Mass attendance plummeted, donations froze, questions surged toward Craig, who held a press conference and admitted, tearfully, that layers of the church's financial activities had been shielded from oversight, and that he himself had signed off on forms he never read. As the scandal spread, an anonymous whistleblower forwarded Melanie a folder of emails between Harold and a contractor tied to Brulin Holdings. One exchange stood out. Zone Lot 12, final stage. Harold had written, "The pressure's mounting. I can't keep lying to Monica. She wants answers. If this gets out, it won't just end the church, it'll bring federal out." The contractor replied simply, "Then make her believe in something bigger. Give her a mission." Simultaneously, law enforcement uncovered property titles tracing back to shell LLCs that paid no taxes but contributed to the church's sanitization fund. One such LLC had been dissolved abruptly 3 weeks after the disappearances. Another was still active, owned by a former parishioner who had moved out of state years ago, unaware her name had been used. When Melanie reached her by phone, the woman sobbed. "I gave them my signature for a stewardship project. They said it was symbolic. I didn't know they used it to buy land." As Ellis testified in a closed-door session with county officials, his former church email account was accessed remotely. The IT team tracked the breach to a public Wi-Fi network near the state line. The IP address led nowhere conclusive, but timing lined up with the final traffic cam sighting of Monica's car. Marcus speculated aloud, what if she ran with proof? What if that drive, this entire trail, was her trying to expose them? There was a question without an answer, but the implication left silence in its wake. Melanie published a full expose under the headline, Sanctity for Sale, How Faith Became a Front-Most Read Article in 3 Decades. But the Chronicle's servers suffered a targeted attack hours later, erasing backups and flooding inboxes with spam. Someone was still watching, still invested in keeping the story fragmented. Yet the truth, long buried beneath veils of doctrine and ritual, had clawed its way into the light, ugly, corporate, and undeniably human. The revelations had turned Elmsworth from a quiet parish town into a national headline. News crews, friends of the Vanitors, and internet sleuths began circling like vultures, feeding on the financial and moral decay that had seeped into the soul of St. Isidore. Yet even as the broader scandal gained traction, the question at the heart of the matter remained. Where were Monica Ray, Foster, and Thomas Merrow? And what had truly happened to Harold Clements? That final thread unraveled 1 month after the expose was published, when a field agent from the U.S. Marshal Service received a tip from a non-newcomers living under assumed names. The trio, posing as siblings working on agricultural self-sufficiency, had been residents for over 6 months. Background checks flagged inconsistencies in their documentation. When officers arrived, the eldest male tried to flee but was quickly apprehended. Fingerprinting confirmed it, Thomas Merrow alive. Monica and Eli surrendered without resistance, visibly aged, emotionally guarded, but lucid. They were brought into protective custody under high security. When questioned separately, all 3 gave matching stories, that after discovering the extent of the laundering and the White Column Society's manipulation, they had confronted Harold, who initially refused to flee. But as surveillance intensified and threats became more personal, they claimed to have received warnings, some subtle, some explicit, that remaining would mean silencing, not exile. They didn't trust the police, fearing infiltration. This wasn't just about faith, Monica told investigators. This was control. They watched us long before we knew they existed. Their plan, according to Eli, was simple: disappear, document everything, and once they reached safety, release the truth. But after settling in Maine, they realized the risk was greater than anticipated. We weren't hiding from law enforcement, Monica said. We were hiding from whoever used the church as their stage. When asked about Harold, their expressions shifted. Monica became visibly shaken. Baby stayed behind to buy us time, she said. He believed if one of us played along, it would confuse the pattern. We didn't know they'd turn on him too. Days later, in a separate and unrelated motel outside Hartford, Connecticut, the body of a man identified as Harold Clements was found by a housekeeper during routine cleaning. He had checked in under the name Joel Morris, left no luggage, and carried only a notebook, a burner phone, and $200, 0 cents in cash. The coroner estimated time of death to be roughly 2 weeks prior, overlapping with the time Monica's vehicle had been seen near the Canadian border. The notebook was written in Harold's unmistakable hand. The final entry was 20 pages long, a complete account of the inner workings of the laundering scheme, the role of the White Column Society, and the progression from concern to conspiracy. He detailed how the society had begun as a donor group but shifted into a monitoring body, tasking selected clergy with discreetly recruiting financially desperate institutions into quiet compliance. It was never about faith, he wrote. It was about conversion, of land, of people, of power. He confirmed that Thomas had originally agreed to play along, but began resisting as the demands grew darker. Eli, skeptical from the start, tried to warn Monica, whose eventual shift was the catalyst for their decision to run. The most chilling paragraph, however, came near the end. The narrative must always be theirs. If you try to flip the script, they'll label you deluded, radical, lost. That's how they survive. They make you look like the heretic for telling the truth. Harold's autopsy revealed no signs of foul play. Official cause, overdose, but the absence of narcotics in his possession, the deliberate order of his notes, and the lack of a suicide message led some to suspect he had been administered a dose unknowingly, his death meant to look like escape fatigue. The documents were authenticated, scanned, and made public. Public outrage returned with renewed fury. Lawsuits were filed, investigations expanded, 2 board members of Braylon Holdings resigned, a third vanished. Federal investigators launched a joint task force targeting laundering through religious channels, citing St. Isidore as a case study in systemic abuse masked by doctrine. But for Elmsworth, the damage was permanent. Indefinitely, the stained glass windows boarded up. The town's trust splintered. Some turned inward, others left altogether. In the months that followed, Melanie Grant released a podcast series titled Sanctified Silence, detailing each layer of the case. It became a national sensation, not for its salacious details, but for how hauntingly ordinary the deception had begun. A need for funding, a chain of silence, and then years of orchestrated obedience mistaken for devotion. Marcus Bell moved out of town shortly after the final episode aired. He left no message, no forwarding address, only a note for Melanie, folded inside a copy of the original binder. What we believed was salvation was only leverage. Monica, Eli, and Thomas were placed under witness protection after testifying before a grand jury. Their current whereabouts remained classified, yet through their testimonies and Harold's posthumous confession, the full picture emerged. The disappearances weren't the actions of cowards or cultists. They were calculated removals, choices made under duress, silence maintained through threat, and a final, desperate hope that someone would notice the path. Someone did. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next mystery that might be hiding in plain sight. Hit like if you felt the tension building, and let me know in the comments what moment shocked you the most. And by the way, where in the world are you watching from? I'm curious how far this story has traveled.